Hello everyone, I'm Dipanita Das, faculty of CBEDU School of Pro-Expressionism. At the outset, I'd like to welcome you all, the faculty members, staff, all my students and other attendees. Here we have a team of panelists. I'd like to name Mr. Sagar Gokhale, Mr. Amay Polekar, Mr. Hemant Ravte and Mrs. Shashwati Shweta. It's an honor and pleasure to welcome Mr. Tom Metcalfe, who is a senior journalist of Bloomberg News, London. So before we start the webinar today, I'd like to give a brief introduction of him. Mr. Metcalfe is a wealth reporter for Bloomberg News based in London. He's working since 2013. He has also worked with Newswire Bureau in San Francisco and New York. He has covered tax havens, Jeffrey Epstein, and now the impact of coronavirus. He has specialized in financial journalism at City University in London. So coming back to the topic, coronavirus covering a pandemic in Europe and USA. As we are all witnessing, coronavirus has brought the entire world to a halt. And journalists all over the world are playing a key role in covering this pandemic. They are risking their lives to cover related stories. And it's already been reported that several journalists have been tested positive for this virus. So we would like to know from Mr. Metcalfe today, the ground reality, what's happening, the challenges, as well as what's happening in the newsroom in Europe and USA. I would ask all the attendees, before we start, we have a question and answer slot. So if you have any questions, please, you can use that platform. And in the meantime, while we are having this discussion, Mr. Metcalfe will respond to all your questions. Yes, thank you for joining us. Over to you, Mr. Metcalfe.
Hey, thank you very much. And hello, everyone. Greetings from London. Yeah, pleasure and an honor to be here. And unusual times, obviously. It's the first time I've ever done one of these via a Zoom. So do shout if perhaps my connection turns bad and you need me to repeat anything, or as I say, very keen to answer questions, I think. So very happy if people sort of fire them over, and we'll try and get through them all towards the end. So I just thought I'd start by sketching out what I'm seeing in Europe and the US, and I've also got a few thoughts in terms of what this means for journalism as a whole, because I understand most of the folk listening in are undergraduates going through the journalism course and communication course. So I'm sure that's probably top of many people's minds what this might look like going forward for the industry, and I'll try and answer that as best I can as well. But yeah, as sort of mentioned, so I'm the journalist for the Bloomberg Newswire in our London bureau. And I mean, ever since I think the kind of implications of this became apparent, everything's really changed for pretty much every journalist, certainly in London and around the world. Obviously, the first impact of coronavirus was seen in Asia. So what we saw was sort of a ripple effect. We have dozens of bureaus in Asia, including Mumbai and Delhi. And particularly in our Chinese bureaus, immediately the sort of working environment was changed, as you'd expect. So bureaus have been shut. There's a lot of restrictions on travel, and I remember in January and February looking at that, going, "Wow, that must be very intense to live through." Not realizing in about 4 or 5 weeks, pretty much the whole world would be facing those kind of things. So, I should probably be clear in terms of what I do is definitely not what I would consider the front lines. So I cover sort of business and wealth for Bloomberg. And while I'm writing about coronavirus, there's certainly reporters in Asia for us and London and America who are much more kind of, might be covering the hospitals, the government responses and who are like, I guess, directly facing the full impact of this. But I obviously talk to them, work with them. So I'll try and convey a little bit of what they're going through, which is really on the extreme side of the journalism experience here, and also how I think I thought it might be useful to let you know how Bloomberg as well has sort of adapted and is trying to cover the sort of unprecedented times. So, you know, for a journalist who's going out there trying to report on highly contagious disease, how do you actually do that? You know, in London, for example, there's pretty much no non-essential travel is allowed. You know, journalism is regarded as essential, so you can still go out and talk to people, you know, respecting all the obvious social distancing requirements. But the reality is, you know, it's very difficult to basically do what you might consider normal sort of gumshoe reporting, i.e. walking around, talking to people, you know, doorstepping in some cases, trying to speak to officials. That would sort of be a big problem on the public health side of things. So what even journalists who are writing about the impact in hospitals and stuff, it's much more remote. Again, there's nothing surprising about that, but the challenges are quite unique. So one of the first things I wrote down is how do you know, find stories, and how do you kind of keep up with sources and stuff like that under these restrictions? And you know, one of the reality is a bit like obviously your university has done as well, is hey, there's Zoom, there's all this stuff where you're going to sort of have to just adapt to a new way of speaking. One of my favorite things as a journalist is talking to people in person, going to a bar or a restaurant, or sidelines of a conference, because that's where you really get this you know, sort of intangible connection, and sometimes you'll learn stuff you won't in person. But you know, that's just basically not feasible. It's not happening. So instead what you do, and this is a real advantage actually, is, you know, everyone is pretty much stuck at home, and that means a lot of experts, a lot of, you know, sort of government decision makers, they are suddenly a lot more accessible in terms of having their personal mobile number, or, you know, they, like everyone else, have sort of completely different schedules and may have more time to sort of chat to a journalist. So that was actually a missive that went around the Bloomberg newsroom, is, you know, obviously this is challenging times, but actually if you spent years trying to get someone's mobile number or be able to get to the point where you can, you know, whether it's a message on WhatsApp to get their thoughts on something or speak to them, this is now the time where you reach out to the, you know, in the UK, they'll might have a PR person or assistant who's always been in between them. And what I'm finding is that sort of, not, you know, block or middle person has disappeared, which actually, you know, speaking for myself, I tend to speak to, you know, I cover wealth, so I might be speaking to billionaires or CEOs, and the change has been, or bankers, and the change has been quite remarkable. I'm now connecting directly with them, and, you know, from Bloomberg's point of view, a story on what a private bank might be doing or seeing, that's actually a great extra access, because you suddenly get the immediate decision maker talking to you. So that's something I would say is, you know, like everything, you adapt to the circumstances and see the positives. But for sure, it's a really tough circumstance, you know, for everyone. So one of the things I joined was, there's a couple of British journalists out there who sort of, you know, might work for Sky or the BBC, and they've set up a WhatsApp group with about, I don't know, 100, 200 journalists here. And what they're doing is just kind of sharing stories, trying to like let off some steam. And it's quite fascinating seeing that side of things. So what they have to do in the UK, sorry, excuse me, it's my mobile. It's going off quite a lot these days. But what they're doing on the sort of TV side of things is pooling their resources. So everyone is sharing kind of the network capabilities. So for example, for the Downing Street briefings, which are every day at 5 p.m, Sky News might have responsibility, then the BBC, and also everyone, there's kind of quite a sort of community feel with that, I suppose. And, you know, I'm also pretty positive in terms of what I'm seeing from various news organizations is, you know, a lot of them have really stepped up to the plate. So I'm going to try and share my screen here. So apologies if I disappear, but I should be able to come back. So let's see, is this the one? No, this one, here we go. So I just wanted to show a couple of examples. I used to work out of the US, and that really the New York Times really stands out in terms of, especially on mobiles, but how they're presenting their coverage. So what they're seeing very popular is stuff like this, as we are, is these live blogs where basically this is what people are reading: how many deaths a day, who is there a vaccine anywhere, what the governments are saying, what the governments are doing. And that kind of the kind of resources going into these live blogs is really enormous at the moment. And I think that's going to be it was already moving towards that, but that's probably going to be the biggest change. Is for these big stories, you're going to see far fewer of the, like, here's a 2,000 word separate piece. Instead, you'll be like, as a whole team of reporters, kind of throwing in much smaller bite-sized pieces of news. And I think if you're looking for someone doing it very well, I'd look at the New York Times. They have obviously fantastic resources, and visually on the mobile app, and to a lesser extent this desktops thing here, it's it's very user friendly, and it's kind of getting the information that people are reading. A lot of the people I talk to, my sources, the readers who come back are basically the only thing they're reading is obviously coronavirus, and typically they're not looking to read 20, 30 different stories a day. They'd love to get it all in one place. So I think the New York Times has done very well on kind of an international basis. And then also, I'd also flag the FT on the data side. So here was a really interesting piece they did, and I'll come to this about the challenges of covering coronavirus, but basically, looking at the official figures and effectively saying, hey, the government data is probably undercounting the deaths right here, and taking the time to go through and analyze it for their readers and show, it's a pretty incredible headline, like, wow, we're sort of way low on the official figures. And like everyone, and I think this is very good, the coronavirus coverage is becoming free. And I think that's an interesting question going on is, this is obviously a public news story. It's a national health story. It's an international health story. And how do you go about delivering that news, which might be of vital importance? Should you kind of be making people pay for that or not? And then that brings in the challenge of like the cost of journalism and how you can fund that and how you can make it a sustainable business model. And that's been pretty high of mind actually this week in the UK, because what the UK's Sunday paper, the Sunday Times did, they did this huge piece on effectively the UK government response, which was front page of their paper. And this was all behind a paywall, at least initially. And effectively, you may have even seen it on Twitter, a few people went, oh, this is not right, it's behind a paywall, and ended up tweeting out the entire document or article. And that generated a huge uproar, because obviously, this is fantastic investigative journalism, very expensive to do. And, they obviously need subscribers to be able to make sure these kind of stories can happen in the future. But the counter argument to that is, this is pretty much of vital importance. Should it be basically only accessible to a few? And that's all kind of an age-old debate since the internet, basically. But it's kind of become heightened in this crisis. And that's another topic we could explore. Fascinating what the government here responded. They basically set out a huge sort of rebuttal of it, and it's too long to sort of really, it's like thousands of words, I think. But it's very interesting that they have kind of chosen to respond in such a way. It's really only happened since the coronavirus broke out that they've kind of responded to sort of media coverage like this. And I think there's interesting questions here on kind of this battle between sort of, the government, the press, what should the press be allowed to say, etc. And in such intense times, it seems coronavirus has really heightened that. Anyway, that was sort of a grab bag of various thoughts I have on this. And I don't know if Dipinita, you want to sort of pick out one or two. I'll stop sharing my screen and we can talk about that, or I can continue, or there may be questions already, whatever you prefer.
Yeah, there are
Yeah, Deepalita ma'am, please go ahead.
questions so far. But yes, if you could also, tell us, when there are a lot of, because it must be flooded with stories, online stories, right? So coming from citizen media and even, the fake stories. So we would also like to know how that has been, handled. I mean, how journalists are handling this situation when you see a lot of myths and you see fake stories being flooded online.
Yeah, so that was on this sort of WhatsApp group I mentioned of UK journalists. That's probably the most common topic of conversation, actually. So there's a few sort of things that obviously have been developing over the past few years. Yeah, with the idea of citizen journalism, it's sort of become very polarized, the news, and there's a real, kind of lots of questioning among readers about, what's sort of news and what's fake news. And this is probably even more kind of pointed and necessary a discussion in a time where, if someone is giving out bad advice or sort of not necessarily the scientific or government advice, that is putting people's lives at risks. And it's as a journalist, it's quite exhausting in some ways, because you might be out there putting out an article or on Twitter, and no matter what the article actually says, people might just look at the headline. This is just the reality of how people read. They might look at the headline, put their own perceptions on it, and then either attack you or twist it in such a way. So it's a very, and that much of the responsibility is on the journalist. You've got to make sure you write your headlines so they're clear and fair and factual, and all of the article, if people read it, that it's very clear the point you're making. But even so, the reality of kind of social media, immediate responses, it is sort of, the articles can get twisted, I suppose, or people use them for their own ends. And that's very interesting. I mean, a newswire like Bloomberg, for example, is very, we're all about just the news, the hard news, the facts. So it probably impacts us somewhat less. But for example, here we have the BBC, and you have like the political editors, and they are, if you go and look at their Twitters, they are under constant kind of attack almost, or facing a lot of sort of criticism, some justly. And it's just a whole new world. So, the way I deal with it is, that's the thing. I just make sure I put my articles out, and that's the most important thing for me as a journalist, is it's just kind of play it straight. I'm not an opinion writer. They do their own things, but if you just put the facts out there, don't try and go for a headline. A common mistake, I think, or perhaps more with outlets where they're requiring like the clicks, is you do need that headline to draw people in, but it's the problem is people either feel like you've kind of been obviously if you push the headline, it either gets misinterpreted, or people come and read and be like, that's about something totally different. So I think it's definitely a massive difficulty for the wider industry, and that's why I feel, personally speaking, working for Bloomberg, it's sort of a very privileged position, because their business model is actually not really on advertising at all. They sort of have bankers subscribing to the terminal, the data service, and part of that is the news service. So we are sort of one step removed from the sort of red in tooth and claw of the economics of the media world. So we're lucky to have the resources and that sort of step back. But it's very tough. And if you look at what's happening, just sort of on a personal note for journalists, is no one saw this coming. So people have kind of gone to maybe some media startups like Protocol in San Francisco, set up maybe in January, and they've just announced they're shutting down. And I think the whole sort of economics are just becoming more and more sort of difficult, I suppose, for everyone. If you're in the advertising revenue streams, you are in real trouble, because no one's buying anything, therefore no one's advertising. And someone like the New York Times, they've got a really good subscription model, same with the Washington Post, but almost every other paper in the US pretty much relies on advertising as their main revenue stream, and that has just fallen. Like, so your entire business is going to need to be rethought. The good thing is journalism's been right in the vanguard of this for 10 years, right? Like, they were immediately it was sort of most vulnerable to sort of the internet, and you know, you can kind of have that debate about whether the idea of making your content free on the internet initially was a wise move, but at least they've kind of had that experience and been through a very painful kind of retrenching. That this moment is on the economic side probably less surprising and damaging for our industry. And then the other thing I'd say I always like to be positive is my experience as a journalist in this case is you know, this is why you want to be a journalist, right? A lot of people who I know working in other industries, you know, they're finding this really tough because, you know, their jobs might not be possible to do in such circumstances at all, or B, they're quite kind of questioning, why am I doing this? You know, the world is changing as we speak. You know, why am I out there selling a widget, for example, which probably will have no purpose or point in you know, whatever the new world looks like. And that's the great thing about journalism is you know, for example, I'm working more than ever. It's definitely more stressful, and there's no, you know, very clear, like, this is an important service you're doing. Whatever you're writing about, people are really want to know. And you can see that in the subscription side of things, because the Times, the Post, all of them have seen huge uplifts in their readers online, as have we. And, you know, this goes to another point of, you know, kind of coming back to the beginning again, I suppose, is people definitely in a situation like this are moving back towards kind of the quality side of things. So there's an interesting study out there about the more sort of polemical articles and websites in the US. They haven't seen such a big uptick in traffic, because when push comes to such shove, people would rather get their kind of news that might affect their health, or at least broadly speaking, from the sort of established legacy, for want of a better word, old media players. So that's kind of interesting. And then of course it's like everyone have a, you know, what does it look like after this, the industry? And it's going to be interesting, I suppose. Again, as I say, this kind of crisis actually really helps the world. You know, in some cases, like the Guardian here is actually employing more journalists, which we haven't seen for a few years, just because there's such a volume of news, and you know, you really need to cover a whole range of topics to make sure you know, you're providing a useful news service. So I think in some ways it will be positive for those you know, for those outlets that survive. They will need more journalists. They will need, and also working will be much more adaptable. I'll come to that after this, in terms of what the newsroom might look like practically. So I think, funnily enough, journalism might do better than most industries, but it will still be, I mean, this is going to be a depression or a recession. So it's going to be a painful time, but I think if you're in the right spots, it could be really, really interesting.
Right. Here we have a few questions coming in. Can we take the questions?
Yeah, please.
Okay.
Great.
So one of the questions from our student said, "Sir, International Monetary Fund has stated that the world might face a recession worse than the Great Depression. What do you think should be our stance moving forward?"
In our stance in terms of journalists, or how would you interpret that question? I'll try and offer an answer. In terms of what we expect is going to happen, I guess.
Yes, that's what I think. Journalism, yes, that's what she meant.
Okay, well, so sort of, yeah, I think that's absolutely fair. Almost every prediction out there is pretty grim reading. I mean, I've been covering the markets since 2012, and these last month or two have been unbelievable. So, you know, you obviously had the 08-09 crisis, and we were speaking about this in a kind of all hands meeting. So people are like, well, what's it like for people who covered the global financial crisis compared to this one? And our sort of editor-in-chief was basically saying, well, last time the 08-09 crisis was, horrendous, huge news flow. It felt like the financial market might collapse, but there was always a light at the end of the tunnel. It was sort of a plumbing issue with the world economy. You had to clear it out at an enormous cost. But it was not like people's lives in the wider sense. People were still going to their Walmarts. People were still going to restaurants and bars. Whereas here, this is, it's like the other way. The global financial crisis was a financial crisis that kind of affected the main economy, the world economy. And this is a health crisis, which has basically brought the world economy to its knees. So all those predictions, the question mentioned, like the IMF, I suspect they'll probably come to pass. And that is obviously very, very bad for all industries, and it will be very tough times. And, it's impossible to know. I mean, that's no one, I think I'd include government for this, really knows what's going to happen. We haven't tried, China has sort of reopened Wuhan, and that's gone okay. And if that sort of remains, the fact they are able to go back to business as usual, it may not be a sort of Great Depression. But then you look at Singapore, who did everything right. They apparently the sort of facilities out there, the testing, all the kind of government intervention was right what experts would recommend. And now they're back up to, I think, 1,000 cases a day, admittedly in very concentrated dormitories and stuff. But that's the sort of the real worry is, if you can get reinfected from this, so it doesn't matter if you've had it before, you can still get reinfected. If sort of reopening kind of, these quarantine of 4, 5, 6 weeks don't really change things, you kind of reopen and then boom, you're back hit by it, then it's very difficult to see how the economy that we had before will ever be the same again. And I mean, look at, the industries most hit. You look at airlines, hotels, I mean, cruise liners. Let's say you're looking at any of that, like, why would people get back on a cruise ship if there is this risk? Most people probably will not, and that's like a secular change, and who knows what that means for them. And similarly, airlines. I covered Richard Branson, and his Australian airline just went into administration. So yeah, I think it's going to be a totally different world realistically. And this is unrelated to the coronavirus, but I once got a piece of advice, like, if you're going to do something in business, just do it in an area that's growing and kind of profitable or whatnot, because even if you do moderately well, you'll still do well. And I think that's the point, is maybe when you have a clear idea of what the economy will look like, look at the areas that are likely to boom. We're doing this webinar on Zoom, right? That guy, the Eric Wan, I think his name, he's one of the wealthiest people in the world now, because Zoom shares have almost doubled and it's doing fantastically. So anything remote, anything like online learning will probably do pretty well. So yeah, it's kind of terrifying, but it's also interesting. And especially for folk thinking of journalism, that is not like it was an industry that was sort of like the airline industry, just kind of raking in cash from the current system. It was struggling. So in terms of journalism, perhaps this will be really interesting times, and there'll definitely be some winners, and it's a case of being able to sort of see which way that goes and going from there. So maybe it's podcasts, huge things, and that could well be sort of you'll probably see a lot more type of media along those lines, because people maybe have more time to wander around on their own listening to things, so it could be that way as well. Anyway, sorry, I bounced around a bit there, but it's all fascinating, but the short answer is I have no idea. No one does. If you do know, let me know, because that would be a great way to look like a real prophet. I mean, and the other thing is, this is definitely unbelievable times. Like the oil market, albeit for a technicality, went negative. This is like, imagine someone saying that in January. You'd have thrown them out. You could buy a barrel of oil for negative $37. I know Mukesh Ambani would be like, what? So, and he's a great example, actually. A colleague of mine did a story on him yesterday. Obviously, there's that big deal with Facebook. He's obviously got the world's biggest oil refinery, but at the same time, quite wisely, he's obviously diversified, and perhaps that Facebook arm will become, the big, as the people expect, the big money generator going forward. Who knows what will happen to sort of the refinery itself, but he certainly positioned himself kind of for all sorts of worlds.
Right. We have another question. How do you structure your stories in a proper form?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And right now, it's slightly different. So again, what Bloomberg are doing in terms of, that's the great thing about modern journalism. You can see how long readers read stories, which stories they read. And frankly, especially now when there's so much news, people don't want to read long stories. So the most important thing is don't just write 1,000 words for the sake of it. Maybe it's a 200-word story or a sort of 400-word. But in terms of how we're doing it, the sort of missives are, make sure it's worth writing a separate story. Like, don't just write something for the sake of it, or because, hey, it's News Israel, where you can put it into a bigger story or into one of those live blogs, keep it shorter. In terms of how I personally structure my stories, so I'm typically not writing about the sort of the deaths or the sort of day-by-day daily briefings. So I have to kind of really think why a story I write would be of interest to people, because it's not like this is what I need to do to sort of protect myself or anything like that. So the way I often think about it, and this is more for enterprise stories, is what you want to write about people. So that's how people respond to that. If you're able to write a story about something very wonky, let's say the oil going to negative, very hard to get general readers into that. Or the easier way is to find, Mrs. X or Mr. Y and be like, oh man, I'm storing oil and getting paid for it. And, I'm in Texas with a kind of tractor and I just move these barrels around and bury them in my lawn. And that kind of scene will get people's interest. And then I often, you're just meant to do it as a pyramid, basically. So all the fun stuff at the top, and then keep the kind of the background further down, so people have a clear reason why your story is fresh and new. But yeah, no real sort of specific tips. It just depends on the story itself. But certainly in the current climate, as I sort of mentioned, it's either going to be a live blog or a very short, sharp story, because what we're seeing is no one is kind of reading hundreds of words. People need the news now and they want to just react to it. So there's a bit of trying to take the ego out of it. I think everyone likes to think, oh, I've written 2,000 words. Everyone's going to sit down with a cup of tea and spend hours poring over it. But the reality is, sadly, it's probably people are kind of on their screens and desperately trying to read as basically as much as they can in a very limited amount of time. So concision and clarity is probably the two things.
Yes, and people are reading all the more and watching all the more now, because in this lockdown situation. Yes. Can we take the next question?
Yeah, please, as many as you want.
There's a question.
Before sorry to interrupt you, but hello.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Before you ask them, I think we need to club some of the questions from the question bank, because we have some 13 questions, and out of which I think 2-3 are interlinked. So can we just club 3 questions so that Tom can answer these questions in one go? So Deepanita ma'am and Tom, there are 2 questions. One is related to US and when strict lockdown in US, some sort of unrecognized. Hello.
Yes.
Can you hear me clear? Yeah. Tom, can you hear me clearly? I can't hear you. I think your microphone is off, Tom.
You're right. Sorry, bad conference etiquette there from me.
No, no,
Apologies.
no.
I can hear you fine.
No, that's fine. That's absolutely fine. So I'm just going to club 3 questions out of the question bank. One question which says that we would like to know the ground reality of US and Europe. The question says why the coronavirus has hit so hard to European nations and US. What went wrong in health management? That is one question. Same question was from Vishwajit, why coronavirus is spreading like wildfire in US? And connecting to this, some of the US organizations or unrecognized groups, they have started protesting against lockdown. And some mayors also supporting it. So in this situation, how do a journalist or reporter will report either in favor of government or in support of current situation? Right. So I have just clubbed 3 questions so that you can answer them in one book.
Yeah, no, and that's something we're seeing is, you pull out the countries that have been really hard hit. Sorry, it's the US, the UK, Italy, Spain, France to a lesser extent compared to Italy and Spain. So the question was, why is hit so hard? I had a very, very interesting theory about why Italy in particular was hit so hard. Basically, the Italian culture is very family orientated. People tend to maybe multiple generations live in the same home, and certainly every Sunday you might go see your grandmother and your family if you're not already living with them for lunch. And it's very tactile. It's a lot of kind of personal contact. And I think Niall Ferguson was the economist who wrote about this, and it chimed with me. And he was like, that's probably why in Italy it was hit so hard so fast. Older country, and that sort of cultural trend of likely to spread the virus very quickly. So that's one and that's kind of interesting. I'm living in London, and we're 700-800 deaths a day, but it hasn't quite yet hit that peak of Italy. And we are, being British, we're quite reserved. We don't tend to see our family as much as say the Southern Europeans. So definitely some cultural things on play. But then, from the government response, which I think was one of the second questions there is, Germany has done very well. So Germany has basically got a lot of cases, not many deaths. And I think people are looking at that, trying to work out why. And no, to be frank, no one's quite sure exactly why. But I think what you can do is look at the UK response, and I'll come to the US response in a bit. And the UK response is in that Sunday Times article. I'll just quickly share it once more, just so you guys have it. Which basically, this Sunday Times article effectively said we sleepwalked into this problem, that the UK government didn't take it seriously enough until pretty much, I think, the 1st of March. So it was 5 weeks where they didn't really prepare. And then what you have is just sort of a situation where, the NHS just does not have the protective equipment available, and it's just kind of a surge. And, that's what all the responses now are trying to prevent, is this surge where it's basically impossible to care for everyone. And you have to make terrible decisions about, we don't have enough hospital beds, who benefits and who doesn't. And effectively, I think what critics of the UK government would say is they could have been building sort of these temporary hospitals. They could have locked down the UK a lot quicker. And, there's a very big debate going on about whether the government was deliberately trying to get us to do herd immunity. So just basically, effectively getting as many people infected as possible, hopefully most of them not seriously, and then that way the virus can't really come back because 80% of the population have immunity. They now deny that was ever the plan. So it's quite intriguing what was going on there. And then in the US, if you sort of follow the news there, it's fascinating because it's so fractured. And, they've got some very hardline lockdowns in place, particularly in New York. and California. And I think that's something, it's just the reality. You have a huge country, you have a country sort of predicated on freedom, travel, sort of this idea of liberty, obviously. And so politicians, until the deaths really started mounting, have a very hard time trying to justify taking the steps that you maybe saw in China. So, and that's just kind of a cultural thing. And, this is a political system that's sort of the essence of America and the UK, talking specifically about them. So I don't necessarily think it's, I don't know how much blame is actually to be apportioned for the different responses. It's just the reality. If you're not living under a kind of sort of status country like China, where perhaps government dictates are a bit more closely followed and revered, this is unfortunately what was happening. But I think on the flip side, what you're seeing in China is the population are probably, even though they may be allowed to go out now, are much more sort of nervous about going back to bars, etc., and congregating together. Whereas I think the problem will be the opposite in the UK and the US. As soon as the government says lockdown is over, we'll probably all be running to the nearest pub, and changing those cultural things is probably impossible. So what it probably means, interestingly, is governments need to kind of reflect on what their population is doing, not blindly, let's say, follow what China or Singapore seem to did well and work for them. Is work out what will work for the US or the UK. And then the US, I love that question about the protests. And we're all on Twitter, I suppose, and it's all very much an echo chamber. And so I'm seeing these sort of videos of these protesters going, freedom and, let's get out of this lockdown immediately. And obviously a lot of people are like aghast at this and going, oh, how irresponsible. So there's two things I've flagged. One is there was an interesting article about those protests that they are not necessarily like a ground movement. So they're more likely, or there's evidence that they're being funded by a very specific section of the right in America, and perhaps not reflective of, say, the wider Republican base, where there's obviously a lot more old people. So one thing is just in terms of how widespread those protests are, it's they may not be as widespread as they look, and they may be kind of being designed to sort of look like there's more support for such an extreme position in terms of completely unlock the country. But yeah, otherwise, in terms of why those protests are there, I think it's very, very natural. And, this is the crazy thing about a pandemic, right? Like it's if you're not affected by coronavirus, you can see a reason why people are like, well, why are we worrying about it? It's a very selfish attitude, I would say. But, if you maybe contracted coronavirus or know someone who contracted it and just had a mild cough, then, they are probably more likely to be out there protesting. But, I think it's just sort of the plurality of a democracy, right? Everyone has their own opinion. And to be honest, again, no one really knows what the best scenario is here. And that's probably the most interesting debate right now is, are these measures by the government, which are obviously for our health, very important, but is the sort of cure worse than the disease? Because certainly in the UK, I think something like 12 million employees have applied for sort of wage help from the UK government. And, what is worse for people is I guess the threat of hunger or the worry of not, being able to earn a living wage or catching this. It's a horrible decision to have to make. But it is interesting. It's not perhaps as, I think talking of in the UK and the US in terms of the sentiment, I do think there's a strong sort of sense that in the next few weeks, there better be an exit path, because I think you'll have a lot of people struggling otherwise. Sorry, another very long answer. I'm loving it.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Deepanita ma'am, over
Yes.
to you.
There's another question from one of our faculty members. His question is, China is responsible for coronavirus. What is Bloomberg's stand for this news?
So that's a very popular sort of conspiracy theory really running around, because obviously Wuhan's seen as the epicenter, and then Wuhan has I think it's called a biosafety level 4 lab, which is the highest sort of biolab security, which means they can deal with stuff like Ebola and very infectious diseases. So so some sort of there are some theories out there that, hey, has this been somehow engineered in that lab, or did the lab kind of not follow correct procedure and somehow an infectious disease escaped and became coronavirus? I think all the stuff out there is that is very much sort of like a conspiracy theory and not really the case. I think there was a good article on the lady who runs that lab, who basically went back in and that was her worst nightmare. Like, oh my God, and are we in some way responsible for this? And of course, she, at least in terms of what we're being told, she ran all those tests, and the coronavirus has really nothing to do with anything that they're doing. And so that's obviously the official statements and whatnot. And I think the reason this has been a popular kind of theory is some in the Trump administration have been propagating it. And again, you just want to treat all that stuff with caution. That's when politics kind of comes into the medical side of things. And there's obvious reasons the Trump administration might want to blame China. They're in the middle of a trade war. This is geopolitics. So they're not necessarily unbiased. And I think the other thing on the science side is people, when they're looking at the coronavirus, in terms of it possibly being like a weapon or man-made, they're saying, no, this is so complicated. This is, kind of the only thing that could have created this is nature herself. So, I would be pretty skeptical of such claims. But I think what hasn't helped is, China for sure was not as forthcoming as perhaps they should have been in January. And that's probably sort of fed some of this, because, just recently they've turned around and gone, oh, we actually had 50% more deaths in Wuhan than we realized. And that's that sort of lack of transparency is not helpful, because what you most need in a pandemic is information. You need to know how many people are infected, or what the fatality rate was, or the reproductive rate. And, whether, it's probably unlikely to be kind of deliberate necessarily, but like the inability to get the accurate information immediately, some sort of governments will say that really hindered us. If China had sort of said, oh, this is pretty painful and bad, maybe their responses would have been different. Whereas the sort of the rhetoric out of Beijing for a long time was, this is an infection, but we're okay, it's under control, and then hit the tipping point, and we're obviously where we are now. But no, I would from everything I've read, I would say it's just Mother Nature hitting us pretty painfully, but there's nothing too sort of untoward in terms of it being made in a lab or anything like that.
Okay. Yes, I have clubbed actually. Many of the attendees are asking a question and want to know how the citizens of London have responded to this lockdown. Are they panicking, or are they cooperating? Are they supportive of the situation? So they'd like to know more about it.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. As I say, you could not imagine such a situation even in the start of March. So I think we ended it on March 23rd or 24th. And, I'm speaking from my very sort of small, I live in North London. And what you're seeing is people are kind of, there's definitely no sort of social disorder or anything like that. And frankly, it seems quite a few people are enjoying it because it's such a change of pace, such a different type of lifestyle. So what the restrictions are is you're meant to stay in your home unless you need to go buy food, or you have an essential job to keep the economy running, which, think of sort of food tellers, obviously people working in public transport, nurses. But otherwise, if you have a sort of office job or, a journalist, you're meant to stick at home, and you're allowed to go out for food and for one form of exercise a day. And so far, no, it's actually been met in pretty good spirits. And I mean, this is 3-4 weeks in, 5 weeks in maybe. So I think people are still enjoying it. I think the really interesting point will come after, say, 10 weeks, when you're like, oh, how much longer can we do this? So it's just been extended to, I think, May the 11th, our lockdown. If it comes to May 11th and they go, oh, we're going till the end of August like this, that might be when it gets a bit more kind of people sort of hands in the air. But no, I'd say that's probably been the most, again, it's a wonderful positive. Like, everyone's lives have been changed. And actually the majority, at least in terms of what most people are seeing, is people are just getting on with it. Humans are amazingly adaptable. Like, I'm in a 1-bed flat, and definitely didn't plan on spending 4 or 5 weeks here, but actually, you just kind of end up enjoying it for what it is. And the other thing, this is completely unscientific, but it's been unbelievably good weather in the UK. So we've had sunshine and blue skies. And I think that kind of psychological impact is sort of, everyone sort of keeps people cheerful, even if you're not allowed to go outside for much. But no, like, there hasn't been much, there certainly hasn't been any kind of protests or sort of like in the US, you might have seen people going, just let us out. And I think that's pretty much true of most of Western Europe. There's some wonderful videos going around of the Italians on their balconies singing, stuff like that. So far we are doing okay with it.
Okay. There's another question. It says that there are limitations to go out. So how journalists, they are coming up with stories with exact facts and figures?
Yeah, so what we're lucky at is we're at a sort of point with technology where such things as this conference are possible. And, everyone has a mobile, and you can kind of share things electronically via email. I mean, imagine if this had happened in, even the early 90s or the mid 90s, I think it wouldn't be possible. So I think in terms of practical tips for journalists, it's, the great thing is there's a lot of information out there in terms of how things are structured, and a lot of it's online. So what you're really, really missing is the gumshoe report and going out to speak to people, and also the in-person interviews with sort of for profiles or whatnot. And that makes it harder. For example, it's much harder. Let's say you meet someone for the first time. If you're meeting them on a conference call, it's always going to feel a bit more formal, and that's tough to break through that initial sort of. As a journalist, what you want someone to be when they're talking to you is sort of very open and relaxed, and a conference call where you can always see your own face and stuff like that makes it a bit harder. But again, it's that's a difficulty, but then also probably people are more accessible. So you might be speaking to people you're not necessarily. In terms of maybe what this question was pointed towards is how do you go out and report, what a factory is doing, for example, or what things look like. As I say, for journalists, I carry my press badge around with me if I am going out on a story, and you can go to some places. But I think largely your most of the stories I cover, which are business, you don't really need to do that. So, and that's an important aspect of the lockdown, is journalists are deemed essential, rightly. And so, if you did have to go to XYZ or go into the centre of London or out to the countryside, you could. But a bit like everything, it's just adapting to what the situation is, and trying to make the best of it. And I do think someone asked, what do we expect from this depression or recession? For sure, what will happen is there'll be a lot more of work from home and stuff like this, and remote working. And I think, everyone being forced to do it, people are starting to realize, okay, there are definite downsides, but it's plausible. I never worked from home before this. And I think afterwards, let's say the world largely goes back to normal, I'd still be trying to work from home maybe 1 day a week, because it brings something different. And obviously from a sort of commute and quality of life, it's preferable. But no, as you can see, if you look at newspapers and stuff, like the FT, for example, is being completely produced remotely, so no one at all is in their newsroom. And that would be actually one point I did want to bring up is what this, everyone, remote working will become more common, but it does really show the value, as I'm sure you guys have recognized from like lecturers and classes and seminars. It really shows the value of sometimes people will be in the same room. And, that's what we are missing from our newsroom. I normally sit in a team of 5 or 6 reporters who will cover kind of wealth, and you can have that instantaneous conversation, get a quick read on whether the story you're working on is worthwhile or not. Whereas here, you're all in your silos. So, where that does cause a problem is you've got to make that extra effort to make sure you pick up the phone to call someone rather than just, shout at them across the desks. And you just lose a little bit of that intangible sense of, there's a buzz in the newsroom around a certain story, and that might direct you down a certain avenue, and you don't get that anymore. So I think that's an extra challenge as well, and that's why I do think, assuming everything goes back to relative normality, like this is the newsroom will still be a major part of any journalist.
Yes. The other question is related to US election. It says that what will be the impact of coronavirus on US election, and the decisions of Donald Trump, is it going to affect his election campaign?
Yeah, so that's, before coronavirus, this would have been the story of 2020, right? Like, so I worked out of the US over the 2016 election, and it was incredible how much time and resources go to that every presidential election cycle. Like, it's basically top of the news for 9 months, because you have the opposition party picking their candidate, and then the election itself. And in normal times, we'd probably be having a seminar about the US election, or even the Democratic primary. So you've now got the clarity on Joe Biden versus Donald Trump. And in terms of what the polls are saying, it does seem that Biden is ahead in most of the sort of battleground states, the swing states, which are ones that really matter. And again, this is politics around the world, but it's so polarized in the US that there's only actually, that handful of states, the Ohios, the Pennsylvanias, perhaps the Floridas, that will really dictate who wins the electoral college. But, what's interesting is I think Joe Biden was probably the candidate that Donald Trump was probably most fearful of. It's not going to stop it. He calls him Sleepy Joe, I think, and he'll be very effective at attacking him as well. But I think as a candidate, he's probably much more appealing to Trump voters than an Elizabeth Warren, who's much more left, and frankly speaking is a woman, which is sad to say, but is still probably a problem for a lot of US voters. As the last election perhaps showed, like if Hillary Clinton had been male, it could have been a different result. So I think that's why Trump this is probably his worst case scenario. I think he could have been more confident against the Bernie Sanders and stuff. And the polls suggest that's the case. But, the question is, what will the election look like in such times? Can people actually go in person to vote? And that's got to be keeping election officials up at night, because that's probably the most interesting question, for all countries. Like, if you've got an election like that, is it responsible to hold it? Most people will probably say yes, but then you're like, well, you better make sure by November the 7th, is it, or the 8th, that you're not going to sort of everyone go out and vote and suddenly everyone's always going to come down with the pandemic. So that is just it's such an interesting question. And you've seen a few of the Democratic primaries during the pandemic. They actually forced people went out to vote in person. Some did it remotely. But I think the practicalities are a 2020 election that has to be in person. I don't think they've got the technology to do it remotely. And it'll be just very interesting to watch it. So that's a really interesting story. And obviously we have huge implications whether Trump gets re-elected or Joe Biden comes in. The only thing I'd say is just sort of as a note of caution, I think there's some sense that, wow, if someone beats Trump, kind of, you know, it's sort of a wonderful salve to, let's say, America's political dysfunction. And I don't think that's the case. I think it's sort of, you'll get a Democratic president, but you'll probably have a, you know, kind of Republican Senate, maybe even Congress, and it will still be kind of sort of just quite dysfunctional politics, I'm sure, in the US. So yeah, I would be very interested to know who wins, and I'll be watching it very closely. And again, I'd recommend the New York Times and actually the LA Times does great political coverage as well. But yeah, I mean, right about now, it's fascinating because it's not even in the paper, and it's what, 6 months away, and you'd think it would be huge. So yeah, I mean, and that's actually just generally all these stories. It's just such a different world. Like, you know, who would have thought someone, you know, reporting from Wuhan is probably the most important journalist in 2020. It's really interesting.
Yes. There is another question. China buying stressed assets of several countries is not a conspiracy theory. What is Bloomberg's take on it? And how will China's move form the geopolitics of the future?
Yeah, it's I mean, as I say, that's the word. It's just the geopolitical world. It's the way it ever was, of, you know, kind of great powers shimmying around for influence. You know, I wouldn't say Bloomberg has any kind of sort of, doesn't really have a take on stories, just sort of report it. I mean, I think it's just another sign of, you know, China. What is clear is their response is, you know, they're obviously donating protective equipment, and, you know, from a kind of, yeah, geopolitical angle, in some ways they're trying to increase their influence, you know, through a moment such as this. People obviously desperately need their help, and you know, there seems to be a quid pro quo in some ways of, you know, yes, we're very happy to send over some protective equipment, but you know, make sure you don't criticize, for example, the Chinese response to the pandemic and stuff like that, and sort of that sort of soft power. So, you know, that's the reality of the situation. I think relations were already bad between China and the US. They're now going to be even worse. And in the UK, our foreign office minister basically said, you know, relations with China will not go back to normal after coronavirus. And that's pretty strong words. Typically, we, you know, Britain doesn't typically kind of go in for direct conflict with China because they're so economically powerful. So that would be interesting to see how all those sort of things change. And, you know, all these relationships were basically based on global trade. And what will be interesting is how can that continue? And if it doesn't, what does that mean for the new sort of power balance between countries? So yeah, like everything, you know, politicians, you know, you look at a crisis and it's also an opportunity in some cases for how to position your country and stuff like that. So definitely not surprised that China are doing it. And yeah, it's just the game, I suppose, as they say.
Okay. There's another question saying that how many times you had to break the Bloomberg protocol and help the frontiers, means to say the medical staff, to spread their words directly to responsible authorities by criticizing the government's progress?
Yeah, so I don't think journalists would you know, ever like break protocol. So, but I think what the question is you know, you know, trying to reach a doctor or a medical staff in order to say, hey, this is what's happening on the front line, and which may be different to what the government is saying. And I think that, you know, is vitally important. And you know, I think that word protocol is quite a useful one. You just got to make sure, as you're reporting out, you're not putting anyone at risk. And times before this, you know, that was mainly how you protect your sources, right? That's founding or cornerstone of journalism. Someone is taking a risk, sometimes a great risk, to give you information, and you've got to make sure, that's your responsibility to make sure that they aren't put at sort of harm. So you always protect your sources. I think it's just kind of an extension of that, is that, and then also whatever you're doing in your reporting and stuff is not worsening the sort of health situation. So don't run into a hospital and run up to doctors and get in contact with patients and stuff like that. But there's still plenty of ways you can meet with people. And let's say you did have to meet someone in person. What you probably do is in a park, and the government guidance is 2 meters away, but maybe you're 3-4 meters away. But again, that's the joy of technology. We are, whether we like it or not, we're all connected, even if we're not there physically. And I think most journalists are probably, rather than meeting in person, it's much easier. You have these anonymous email drops, you can have tip lines anonymized. So I would say that is certainly for my line of work, and most at Bloomberg, is you're not so worried about need to meet people in person. It's just making sure someone who might have a story which is important, that they know how to reach you, and can reach you kind of anonymously if they want. But yeah, I would say that's an extra responsibility, and you've got to be very no one wants to do that, no story is worth worsening the pandemic for example, if that was sort of where the question was going.
Yes, I think we'll take this as the last question. It says that, how do you think India is handling this situation? We want to know your views about it.
So, I mean, India is probably the country everyone's really looking towards. Such a huge population, and it'd be very interesting to see how you guys handle it, for example. So I can't claim any special sort of knowledge. What I did see was, I don't know if it's on Netflix over there, but there's a series called Pandemic on Netflix, and one of the sort of subjects of that is various Indian hospitals. And from that, obviously, it's quite a big disparity between sort of some hospitals having, resources, and some being going to be really under the gun. I think it's very, I think there was a pretty quick response in terms of shutting down the country. That I didn't necessarily expect to see, like the whole country to effectively go under quarantine. But I would just say what will be interesting is, I guess, seeing how the sort of data comes out in the next few weeks in terms of cases and stuff. Right now, and maybe this is something being missed by the data I follow, is effectively from Bloomberg and the FT. Right now, I don't think the cases are sort of comparable to certainly to the US or China, which is presumably good news. But perhaps that's a case of the data being lagging or stuff. So, I think in terms of what will definitely happen is there will be an assessment after the fact of, which response was the best, which country really covered themselves in glory in terms of how they responded and hopefully protected their citizens. And you've got a range of responses to look at. So in Sweden, they have basically not locked down at all. Then you've kind of got on the other end of the spectrum, maybe Singapore locked down very quickly, but then released itself too soon. And frankly, so far, at least if you're asking like what I'm reading about, India is not sort of being pinpointed as being particularly bad or particularly good, to be honest. So, but that will probably change. Everything's on a lag, right? So right now the focus is on the US because they're the peak at the moment. And as other countries experience that or perhaps avoid it, that will be discussed. So I guess, the question is, once this is sort of finished, there'll probably be a real accounting of everything, and everyone will need to hopefully learn lessons. And who knows, maybe India will be the example everyone should follow in future, or we'll all be following Sweden's model. I don't know.
I think we have come to end of this webinar. Thank you so much for giving us the time, and I know it's a very busy schedule that you have at present covering this pandemic situation. We got an overall perspective of this situation, the the change in the newsroom, the role and responsibilities of the journalist at this point of time, the government's point of view. Thank you so much for your valuable inputs. Amay sir, would you like to add something here?
Well, at the end, I would only say that, Tom, we are very glad to have interaction with you about the ground reality and other issues related to pandemic. But we would love to have more interactions in future if time and your schedule permits, because I think the time was very big constraint right now. We have a lot of questions. Still, I can see there are around 19 questions, but because of time constraint, we are not able to answer all the questions. So probably we'll try to invite Tom again with his, of course, with his permission and with his compatibility. So definitely would love to have you again on our platform to discuss the questions and issues which students have in their mind. So Tom, thank you so much for being here and interacting with our students.
No, it's actually my pleasure. I would love to do it again. Sorry, some of my answers were a bit long. And if in the meantime, feel free, anyone listening, you can find me on Twitter. And I think my direct messages should be open. So you can just ping me a message if you've got a burning question, or you just want to, always good to know fellow journalists. So just connect over there and we'll go from there.
Yeah, sure. We will share your Twitter handle with our students, and students can directly ask you the questions, right?
Sounds perfect.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Tom. Thank you so much. Deepanita ma'am, over to you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.